Stanford University.
Welcome. Welcome to Stanford Medicine's 11th Annual Contemplation by Design Summit. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, the founder and director of Contemplation by Design. It is my honor to introduce our speaker, Sharon Salzberg, who will be guiding us in an interactive workshop titled Seeds of Compassion. Sharon Salzberg is a meditation pioneer, world-renowned teacher, and New York Times bestselling author. She was among the first to bring mindfulness and loving-kindness meditation to mainstream American culture 50 years ago, inspiring generations of meditation teachers and wellness influencers. Sharon is co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, and the author of 13 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Real Happiness, now in its second edition, and her seminal work, Loving Kindness. Sharon's podcast, The Meta Hour, has amassed 6 million downloads and features interviews with thought leaders from the mindfulness movement and beyond. This interactive workshop extends Sharon's prior sessions. This morning, she guided us through a loving kindness meditation, and the recording of that guided practice will be available on the Contemplation by Design YouTube channel. She also provided us wisdom insights in her talk titled Compassion and Joy, Practicing the Dharma in Times of Uncertainty. Without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming Sharon Salzberg.
Hi, or hi again for many of you who've been with me these last couple of days. So I want to talk a little bit, and then we'll just do questions, have some discussion, and then I'll talk a little bit more and continue on in that way. So the meditation that we did this morning is called Loving Kindness Meditation, and it's part of a bundle of other qualities that are all getting developed, such as compassion, and I'll go into that a little bit later. The word loving kindness, the term, is the common translation for a word from Pali, the language of the original Buddhist text. The word is metta, M-E-T-T-A. The common translation as loving kindness is the one I use, although it's something I felt some ambivalence about, just because as a word, loving kindness is not necessarily something, say, you'd overhear in casual conversation. If you were at a restaurant or a coffee shop and at the next table, they were talking about loving kindness, unless you were familiar with the meditation, it would seem a little bit arcane maybe, or it is a religious term in different traditions, but maybe not used so much in everyday life. And my concern is that it might then make the quality itself seem somewhat removed from day-to-day life and somewhat precious in the negative sense of the word precious. The literal translation of the word metta is friendship. And I also have some issues with that, because as a quality of the heart, metta, or its companion quality, compassion, they don't necessarily and at all really demand a certain action. It's not a mandate for behaving in a certain way. And people often ask me, well, I don't know about doing that work and trying to deepen loving kindness, because then I would have to say yes. I would have to smile meekly when some unjust demand is being placed upon me. Wouldn't that mean I have to lend them more money? Wouldn't that mean I have to let them move back in? And I've heard all the way from, wouldn't that mean I have to go visit my father in prison? And the reason he's in prison is because he abused me so badly. Doesn't it mean that I have to? I have to reach out in this way. I have to be compliant in this way. And it doesn't mean any of that. It's not a mandate for action. It's a purification or transformation of our own motivations. So that, for example, if we've largely been motivated by fear or antipathy in what we do or what we say, what we hold back from doing or saying, we can be motivated by a sense of connection, by compassion, but still perhaps discernment in a particular moment, in a particular context says the best way for me to behave is kind of fierce. It's saying no, it's having a strong boundary. It's finding a balance, say, between compassion for others and compassion for myself. So when I think of the word friendship, I think, let's go to the movies together or let's have dinner together. It implies a certain action, which the cultivation of metta does not necessarily imply at all. It's about our own minds, our own hearts. And we use other faculties like mindfulness in a bigger sense of looking at context, looking at understanding, having wisdom in deciding just what action is appropriate in any particular situation. So my favorite translation, personal, not classical, for me, for the word metta is connection. It's a profound sense of connection to ourselves and ultimately to all of life. It doesn't mean we like somebody. It certainly doesn't mean we approve of their actions, but it's a bone deep knowledge that our lives have something to do with one another. And it's powerful. Sometimes we think of it as sort of gushy and sentimental and weak, but it's powerful because it conveys the truth, the precise truth that our lives are interconnected. We live in an interconnected universe. And the responsiveness we can have to that truth is the force of loving kindness or compassion. One of my favorite images of that had to do with a friend of mine, Bob Thurman, who's recently retired professor of Buddhist studies at Columbia. And he and I would be teaching together, and he would often use this example, which is a very New York City example, but it works. He said, imagine you're on a subway and these Martians come and they zap the subway car so that those of you who are there together are going to be there for the rest of your lives together. So what do? Somebody's hungry, you feed them. Somebody's like freaking out, you try to calm them down, not because you like them or because you approve of them, but because you're going to be together forever. Well, guess what? We're kind of on that subway car. Our lives are genuinely interconnected. And it doesn't take a kind of spiritual understanding to come to that. Economics shows us that. Environmental consciousness certainly shows us that. All kinds of science shows us that. What happens over there doesn't nicely stay over there. It affects us over here. It like links out through these chains of interconnection. And similarly, what we do matters, what we care about, where we put our energy, it matters because it too will ripple out. We live in a world of interconnection. Like my favorite question in going into an organization or a company to teach is, how many other people need to be doing their job well for you to do your job well? Really, it's true. And if you don't commute to work, if you work inside the home or in a different sort of way, what are you relying on? Technology? What? If you do commute to work, do you ever think about that auto mechanic or train conductor? And sometimes I've asked that kind of question and it doesn't resonate. So then I go on to, have you eaten today? And if it's not a distinct animal product, if you don't grow all your own food, someone planted a seed in some soil and they're actually creatures who live in that soil, and someone harvested a crop and transported it. And provided it to you or sold it to you or prepared it and sold it to you. It's like many lives involved in that plate of food sitting in front of you. We live in an interconnected universe. Another image I've liked a lot for that comes from my having, I was once driving in a car with a friend and we were stuck in this incredible, horrible, awful traffic. And we're complaining bitterly about it the whole while. And then at one point, my friend turned to me and said, "Well, we're the traffic too, you know." And I realized, oh, they're probably complaining about us. And I realized that before she said that, it was like that really was a stance of privilege. Like, it's my road. You people are interlopers. You're in my way. You're slowing me down. And when she said that, it was like that sense of center and margin dropped away. And it was just us. We're all the traffic. And you know what? We have a problem, which is traffic. And that means, as far as I can tell, the better level on which to be addressing the problem is that collective, rather than that sense of us and them and self and others so bitterly divided and rigidly held. We're all the traffic. So there's that image from Bob. Say you're in a subway car and these Martians come and they zap the subway car, so you're going to be together forever. And we taught together many times. He used that image many times. And I probably used it more than he because I was really taken by it. Then one day I was sitting on an airplane on my way to Arizona. I was going to be attending some Dalai Lama teachings and also teaching myself beforehand. And it was one of those situations where the plane ended up sitting on the tarmac for about 4 hours delay. And it was getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And people were getting angrier and angrier and screaming, "Let me off this plane." And at one point, the pilot got on the PA system and he said, "No one's getting off this plane. You know, like, just relax." And I wasn't feeling that chipper myself. I kept thinking, I'm paying rent in New York City. I could be in my apartment. You know, why won't they let me off the plane? I get rid of all these people, you know, and try again tomorrow. And then that image, which Bob had used and I had used so many times, came up in my mind. Imagine you're on a subway and you're going to be together forever. And I looked around the plane and I thought, maybe these are my people. You know, and instead of that ire, which was really based on how long am I going to be stuck with you? It was like, here we are together. And I noticed that I was taking an interest in people. I didn't ask them, but I thought, why are you so freaked out? Where are you going? I'm going to the Dalai Lama, you know, like, why are you so freaked out? And it's actually interesting in the Buddhist psychology, one of the ways that anger, an antidote for anger is interest. It's curiosity. Instead of just pushing away and wanting to shove away, and how long are you going to be here with me? Am I stuck with you? It's, we take an interest, and it's a different kind of opening. So loving kindness doesn't mean you like somebody. It doesn't mean you're going to act like a doormat at all, but it is a powerful force within for transforming our own minds and our own field of intention. In the Buddhist psychology also, as these qualities are described, they're talked about as having a far enemy, a near enemy, and a proximate cause. So a little later, we'll talk more specifically about compassion, but staying with loving kindness for a little bit. The far enemy is aversion, which is anger or fear. They're considered the same mind state. Anger being the energized, outflowing form, fear being the held in, frozen form of wanting to push against what's happening, wanting to declare it untrue, separate from it. And it's not to say that we kind of denounce those mind states and think it's wrong to feel them, but it too is an area of interest and investigation. Like, what's it like when we are governed by these states, when anger just takes over, when fear just takes over? They both provide a kind of tunnel vision. Anger, in that psychology, is likened to a forest fire, which burns up its own support, which means it can devastate the host, which is us, our bodies, our nervous system, our minds, our happiness. And like a forest fire, it might burn really wild. So we end up in a place very far from where we actually intended to be. So the challenge is not to hate it or be ashamed of it, but not to get lost in it necessarily and have it dictate our lives. In some ways, we almost want to grab the positive part of it, which is the energy, and be able to utilize energy in maybe very strong action. But that's the far enemy. The near enemy is a state that is really kind of close on the surface to the state we want to cultivate, close enough so that we can get confused, and it can in a way masquerade as that state we're trying to cultivate. So the near enemy of metta or loving kindness is attachment. And this is often confusing in these days because it doesn't mean attachment as is used in Western psychology, but more a sense of wanting to be in control, needing to be in control. We get attached to people and they need to never change. Well, that's folly, right? Because we can't stop that. We get attached to certain expectations and conditions change, and it's very hard to flow with what's happening actually right now. And we feel resentful and we're bitter and we're always frightened if we're attached because that lurking truth of impermanence is out there, and we just want to guard against it. So it's not that attachment is bad or wrong or terrible or we're terrible people, but it is a root cause of suffering if it takes over. If we insist on things being a certain way, I mean, of course, we have goals and we have aspirations, and that makes sense. But attachment is something else, so we can feel the clinging when things have to be a certain way, or we don't even know who we are anymore. So the far enemy, the near enemy, the proximate cause is the nearest arising condition, or the likely springboard for that desired quality to come about. So it's not the only springboard, but it helps make it just easier to cultivate certain qualities. So the proximate cause for loving kindness is twofold. One is seeing the good in someone, even if it's a little sliver within a large pile of difficult behavior. And it's not like we're going to overlook the difficulty or, pretend everything is so great. But if we obsess about and go over and over and over and over the problematic behavior of someone, we will naturally feel more and more alienated and distant. Whereas if we can find that one little sliver of good behavior and recognize it, then we feel some sense of connection, and we can look at all the difficulty in truth, but not with that tremendous gulf of alienation. So we can't always do that, and I'll go on to that in a minute. But it's a somewhat interesting and provocative exercise. And an exercise in the sense that you want to make sure it doesn't make you, oblivious to the rest, but see what happens. So I went to Burma in 1985 for a 3-month period of intensive loving kindness, compassion, and the other qualities all in a bundle. I went to Burma and did this 3 months of meditation training. And one of the exercises is offering loving kindness to someone you find difficult, having built the understanding of all that that means and doesn't mean. And one of the preludes to that is look for the good, see if you can remember one good thing about them. So I went back to my room. I thought of a difficult person right away. I thought he was like really obnoxious. And then I remembered there was a time when I actually saw him do a very nice thing for somebody else. And I saw it. I couldn't just say, oh, someone misinterpreted it, you know. He was really kind to this person we both knew, and he did it in the best possible way. So she didn't feel pitied or put down or anything. And I saw it. So I remembered it. And then I thought, I don't want to think about that. That's too hard. It was easier when he was all bad all the time and I could just go through that list again. But that's the challenge, you know. So sometimes we can't. It's just impossible. And then the other reflection comes into play, which is a strong belief in that system that all beings want to be happy. Everybody actually wants that deeper sense of happiness, of belonging. And we're misguided, we're confused, we're fed lots of distortions and lies and myths about where that happiness is actually to be found. But we all share that fundamental, real yearning inside. So that's the other kind of proximate cause for metta to arise. And I have a friend who tells me, like when she's on a Zoom meeting, you know, she will look at all the faces and all the boxes and think, oh, you want to be happy too, and you want to be happy too, and you want to be happy too. And then they'll have the meeting. So all of these, like I say, they're experiments, they're ways of looking at our conditioning and stepping out and seeing what other things are possible. So I want to open this up to questions or comments, and then I'll go on and talk about what is really a bundle of 4 qualities: loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity.
Thank you, Sharon. Our first question is with respect to the near enemy. And specifically, people are asking about the transition from one identity to another. An individual may have been welcomed into a community such as Stanford University by having gained distinct accomplishments as an athlete, as a researcher, as a leader, or an adult may have been a professor for decades, or an individual may have been a parent and then their children have grown and left the home. Could you speak about how the person is going to turn towards their attachment to their sense of self that is rooted in these external roles?
I think it's a really important question, and it also uh, would be something that I would talk about. And so maybe I'll do it now, also in part. When I talk about equanimity, which is the 4th of those 4 qualities of loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, um, collectively known as the Brahma Viharas in Pali. So equanimity is a funny word for us. It sounds to us like indifference or callousness, or I think of kind of that stereotype of a teenager saying, whatever, you know, like we really care, but we act like we don't. It doesn't mean any of that. It means balance, and it's the balance born of wisdom. And one of the ways that we need wisdom is just in the kind of dynamic that you're describing. As the Buddha talked about it, he talked about praise and blame. He said there's always blame in this world as well as praise. So even though one has the status, one has the stature, if we over-identify with it, it's kind of devastating, not only at big shifts, big transitions, but just not having uniform praise all the time. So the story I usually tell about, well, going back to the Buddha for a moment, the story they tell about him was this group of monks, were just living in the monastery. And one day a man came to hear something about the Buddhist teaching, and he came upon a monk who'd taken a temporary vow of silence. So when he was asked, "Can you say something about the Buddhist teaching?" he was silent. And the man got really furious and he stomped away. So the same man came back a second day, came upon another disciple of the Buddhas who was well known for his theoretical understanding as well as his deep meditation practice. So when he was asked, he launched into a very elaborate theoretical description, and the man got really furious and he stomped away. So the same man came back a third day and came upon another disciple of the Buddhas who they say had heard what happened on the first day and what happened on the second day, and he was careful to say something, but not too much. And the man got really angry. And he said, "Why are you treating such profound matters so sketchily?" And he stomped away. So this group went off to see the Buddha, and they said, "Oh, Buddha, this is what happened on the first day. This is what happened on the second day. This is what happened on the third day. What do you have to say?" And the Buddha said, "There's always blame in this world. If you say nothing, some people will blame you. If you say a lot, some people will blame you. If you say just a little bit, some people will blame you. There's always blame in this world." So does that mean we don't relish the praise? No, we do. We enjoy it. But if we get attached, if we cling, if we insist this never change, we're sunk, right? You can't control somebody else's reaction. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they just won the lottery. They couldn't care less about what you just wrote or said. We listen, we learn from feedback, but if we get attached, if that's our identity, we just lost. And it's seeing the suffering of that we can remind ourselves everything changes. Or do they really know me, or is that just my public persona? Whatever would help you come to some greater state of balance. So the story I usually tell about me was the publication of my very first book, which was called Loving Kindness. It came out in 1995. And it took me a really long time to write it. I mean, for one thing, I didn't have my own computer for most of that process. So cutting and pasting in those days meant typing out and, getting a page printed and then cutting out a paragraph and moving it up and down the page till you knew where you wanted to put it, getting a roll of Scotch tape and pasting it on. So it was a really endless process. Plus, I was very inhibited. I didn't think I could write. There were a lot of things going on. Finally, the book came out. And if you ever see the original hardcover version, you see someone on the blurb said, "We've waited a long time for this book." And someone else said, "In this long awaited first book." And one of my friends actually wrote something like, "Sharon Salzberg has finally given us," and I made the publisher take out the "finally." I said, "That's too much." So it was an enormous big deal for me when this book actually came out. And I was in California. I had lunch with somebody that I hadn't met before. And she said, "Sharon, you wrote that book in such a way. It's just like sitting down and having a conversation with you. It's just like being with you." And I was so overjoyed. I thought, what a beautiful thing to say. And that's just like the best praise I could ever have hoped for. So much so that I was having dinner that night with a whole other group of people, and I brought up the comment from lunch. And someone at the dinner table said, "Well, that's not true. I'm reading your book. Doesn't sound anything like you. It's nothing like being with you." And I thought, okay, you can be ecstatic at lunch and depressed at dinner, or you could take a moment and remember it's the same book, written from whatever was motivating me, with whatever level of skill I could bring forth. One person reacted one way, another person reacted another way. I would never try to pretend I didn't care. I didn't notice. I didn't care. Of course I cared. But how much do we care? If that is the be all and end all of our feeling worth as a human being, we're lost. You never know what that person did before dinner. So again, we can take feedback and we can understand, but we work to have a level of wisdom or understanding, which will give us some balance.
Thank you. The next question, I believe you will be addressing momentarily, but I'll read it now. It says, please develop the distinction of loving kindness versus compassion.
Yeah, I will.
So those are the questions at this point, if you want to move forward.
Sure. Okay, so loving kindness as connection, the proximate cause, let's say, an understanding or even an examination of all beings wanting to be happy and reaching out for happiness, maybe including ourselves in some ways that are confused or unfulfilling, but that bottom line kind of yearning is there. The other three qualities are compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, and they are often talked about in a kind of bundle. The collective name is the Brahma Viharas. Brahma meaning celestial or supreme. One translation I heard of the word which I liked was best. And Vihara meaning dwelling or abiding or home. So taken together, these four qualities are said to form our best home. And like any home, we're not there all of the time. We leave home, but it should be the place where we feel when we're home, the most relaxed, the least pretentious, the most authentic. We're home. Loving kindness being the first of these, compassion being the second of these. Compassion is defined as the trembling or the quivering of the heart in response to seeing pain or suffering. It's a movement of the heart, a movement toward to see if we can be of help. So as I said the other night, it's not a movement into to burn up ourselves, movement toward. And it's not a movement that is one of kind of supremacy, like I'm in charge, I can control things, I can make your suffering go away, like tomorrow, something like that. It's also very much not a hierarchical state, like I've got my life totally together and it always will be, and I'm just bestowing this, little bit of kindness on you way down there. It's not like that at all. So the feel, it's very close to loving kindness. The feeling tone is a little different. Often there's a kind of poignancy in there, like, would that I could come in and seize your suffering and just rid you of it. Would that I could. I once said in front of a group of people, I think if I were in charge of the universe, it would be a lot better a world. And someone in the room challenged me. They said, are you sure? And I thought about it and I responded, I am really sure. It would be so much better. But guess what? It's not so. It's not going to be so. So that doesn't mean I don't try to make a difference and, come forward and try to serve in different ways. But it's different when you feel like you should be in control, right? And that doesn't help the force of compassion. It actually thwarts it. To move toward, to see if you can be of help. It might have a kind of poignancy to it. Would that I could. After all, we're recognizing suffering and our distress of some kind. And I proposed an experiment also last night, like when you're looking at your own mind states that are kind of painful, you're looking at your own anger, your fear, your jealousy, your craving. Most commonly, we are conditioned to calling them bad or wrong or terrible. But see if you can do the exercise of right in that moment, reframing it as painful. instead of like shameful and horrible and stupid or whatever. This really hurts. This is really suffering, this state. And just see what happens as a result. And usually we move from a kind of rejection and dislike to a state of compassion. And then look at what that compassion feels like. It's not overjoyed, like, hey, I'm so glad that I've spent the last hour, full of hatred. But it's kind, and it has that kind of trembling quality, and it's not pretending that it's something else. It's also not blaming, because it hurts. Right. And so that will give you some sense of some of the dimensions of the state of compassion. Look at what it's like when you are looking at someone else and you have a sincere belief that harmful actions come from a place of pain, as they do within us. Just see what happens. It doesn't erase the action, and it doesn't make you say it doesn't matter. Maybe it matters a lot, but just feel what happens inside of you as you take in that understanding as well. So the far enemy of compassion is the state of cruelty. And I often think of cruelty as such a profound state of othering that it kind of doesn't matter to us how we behave. I mean, it's one thing to kick a table. It's another thing to kick a person and feel like you're kicking a table. Right? That's cruelty. The near enemy of compassion is a lot more difficult to kind of explore, or to understand. We need to explore it. Some people will say pity is the near enemy of compassion, and that's true if you think of pity as as that hierarchical state, like I'm great and intact, and you down there, are broken, so I pity you way down there. That would be like a near enemy of compassion. It's close enough at a superficial glance, but if you really look at it, it's very, very different. My problem with pity, you can tell I have problems with all these translations. My problem with pity is that, I went to India in 1970, and any translation I was reading, there were virtually no books in English on Dharma, but any translation I was reading was fairly old-fashioned, and the word pity was interchangeable with compassion. It wasn't considered like a near enemy. So the literal translation of the words conventionally for the near enemy are sorrow or grief, but it also is problematic because it doesn't mean sorrow or grief in the Western psychological sense. It means more despair, or burnout is actually a translation some scholars have offered to me. We look at suffering, we acknowledge it as suffering. We're not trying to pretend it's something else, but we're kind of broken rather than having the energy to go toward, to see if we can be of help. It's too overwhelming. We're exhausted. We're fatigued. We feel we can never do enough, so we never go forward. Those are all kind of near enemies. We think it's compassion, but it's really not, because it's so draining and kind of devastating. Like I went with a colleague, Joseph Goldstein, to the Soviet Union when it was still the Soviet Union to teach, and teaching meditation was actually illegal, which somebody informed me the morning of our departure. And I was like, oh, great. We went as part of a tour group because you had to go. And we even brought like Joseph's mother as cover, and people in the tour group. But in the afternoons, Joseph and I, instead of going to whatever museum, would split off from the group and go to somebody's house with a translator and teach. And it was the same translator. And I was speaking a lot about compassion. And I noticed whenever there was kind of a funny feeling in the room. So I finally sat down with the translator and I said, when I say compassion, what do you say? And they said, oh, it's like this state, you're just broken. You're like nearly destroyed by the suffering that you see. They said, it's like someone has taken a giant stake and driven it through your heart. And I thought, no wonder there's a kind of a funny feeling in the room. But we can actually get close to that in our sense of what compassion should be. But remember that moving toward to see if we can be of help. And if we are devastated, if we're overcome, if we're so tired, it's not actually compassion. We get there because life can be really tough, right? Sometimes. But we need to have a little more balance than that to feel the pain genuinely. But if we are overwhelmed by it, it's not a time of actual compassion. It's like that near enemy. And I think it's inevitable we go there, but we also learn the skills of coming back, of rebalancing, of getting some perspective, of taking care of ourselves and so on, so that we can genuinely look at, say, the ills or the problems in our family, in our community, in the world, with a little more resilience. So the far enemy, the near enemy, the proximate cause of compassion also underlines some of that distinction from loving kindness. If the proximate cause of loving kindness is uh, the understanding that all beings want to be happy, the proximate cause of compassion is the understanding that all beings are vulnerable. As I also said earlier, it's not that we all suffer in the same amount or the same degree, but we are all vulnerable to change, to insecurity. No one's life is perfect. And it's that understanding that has us feel that sense of connection to others that is compassion. So much of various cultures are built around that kind of pretense. Everything is perfect. And if it's not, you should blame yourself. You should feel humiliated if you're sick, if you're frightened. And if other people are, let's just put them away. Like I always think of this woman who came to see me about 6 months after this terrible tragedy and loss in her family. Really terrible. And she said, my friend, first of all, she said, my friends are a little bit impatient with me because they feel like it's been 6 months. Why aren't I all together? And believe me, this was not a 6-month challenge. This was really hard. And then she said, my friends all have golden lives. Nothing ever goes wrong for them. So, because that's, of course, the pretense that we are induced to. Nothing ever goes wrong with them. So now I am like a symbol of life gone awry, and I make them very uncomfortable. Then I had one of those experiences, where you hear these words come out of your mouth. So what I heard come out of my mouth was, I think you need new friends. Then I said, you should meet my friends. They're all a wreck. And sometimes I tell this story in front of a group of friends. I say, it's not that they're a wreck, which is true. They're not. But there can be a kind of honesty about our vulnerability. So that's kind of the flavor of compassion. The third quality is sympathetic joy, which means joy in the happiness of others. Actually taking some delight when we see someone's success or good fortune. It can be a kind of rare but beautiful quality, and some people have it naturally. Something good happens for you, and they're just like so happy for you. And other people, like they may smile, but you really get the feeling they would be just as happy if it all went away for you. And it hurts so much, really. I've had teachers say to me that of these four qualities of loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, sympathetic joy is often the most difficult for people. Not always. Like I taught a group of teenagers the other day just about sympathetic joy, and I said that, and somebody came up to me and somebody, to the microphone and said, I always feel happy when other people are happy. It was like one of those rare gems, that just has it naturally. For most of us, it's kind of a training because we have to challenge certain assumptions, like the assumption that happiness is a limited commodity in this world, and the more someone else has, the less there's going to be for me. The assumption that I have nothing and I will forever, and they have everything and they will forever. So there are a couple of problems with that. First of all, of course, nothing is forever. Everything changes, everything is impermanent. Do we really begrudge this person this happiness? And it's unlikely. I have nothing, absolutely nothing. I may have nothing much I pay attention to or appreciate or feel gratitude for, but nothing. And it's unlikely they have everything. And then there's this kind of weird assumption. It's a little hard to describe, that the prize, the praise, the accolade was heading right toward me. And you stole it from me. If you hadn't done that, it would have landed on me. Now, sometimes, of course, we are in direct competition. We're applying for the same grant or the same job. If you get it, I don't. A lot of times it's not like that. But we feel as though it's like that something has been taken from me. And the story I usually tell about that is I was teaching next door at the Insight Meditation Society, a retreat on these four qualities. And I was giving a talk one night on sympathetic joy. And I just used this example, which just came up in my head. Say you're in New York City and it's Sunday and you go by the New York Times and you open it up. This was a long time ago, before people were reading it digitally. You open it up to the book review section, you open that up to the New York Times bestseller list. And you see that your friend's book has gotten on the New York Times bestseller list. And you immediately think, it shouldn't have been their book, it should have been my book. They don't deserve it, I deserve it. So I just use this example in the talk, and by the oddest of coincidences, I had 3 friends sitting that retreat, each of whom had a book on the New York Times bestseller list. And they each came up to me after the talk and said, is that how you felt when you saw my book on the list? And I said, no, of course not, never. Right. But we do sometimes. But the New York Times wasn't driving around with my address and heading toward me when they got kidnapped. So I'm not saying you jump up and down with joy. Hey, my book wasn't on there, theirs was. But you don't have to feel that kind of jealousy and envy, and they took something away from me, and the bitterness and the alienation. And when we get lost in that, we are just ever more lonely because it's us against the world all the time. So the far enemy of sympathetic joy, that happiness and the happiness of others, is jealousy or envy. The near enemy is also a little bit harder to describe. I've seen it in different forms. Some people say giddiness, just being happy for no good reason, not because you're looking at the happiness of others. More meaningful translation for me is comparison. It's just like endlessly comparing, endlessly. Am I better? Am I worse? Am I the same? Am I better? Am I worse? Am I the same? So we don't actually generate the happiness toward others, but it has that same element of looking at their situation. That's why it's a near enemy. Now, interestingly enough, in the Buddhist psychology, comparison is considered a hindrance to our happiness, to our well-being, no matter what the conclusion is. Am I better than? Am I worse than? Am I equal to? Because it's endless. There's always another person to compare oneself to. So the near enemy, the far enemy, the proximate cause of sympathetic joy is, in a way, it's developing gratitude for our own happiness, so that if we look at the situation of others, it's not from that place of deficit, like they've got everything and I have nothing. We also need to be able to take in the happiness of others and not sort of try to repackage it like couldn't be as good as it looks, Like that doesn't mean that we lose intelligence or wisdom. People often ask that, well, am I supposed to have sympathetic joy for somebody who made a lot of money spoiling the earth or hurting other people? And it's like, no, you're not supposed to become unaware or unawakened. But more commonly, the issue for us is someone's not, you know, deserving the way I am, or they shouldn't have gotten it, or um, why do they look better than me, or something like that, which again, it's very corrosive to our own well-being. So then equanimity as the last of the Brahmaviharas means balance. And it's, in this context, it's the balance born of wisdom. It's taking our perspective. It's taking our life experience. Nobody has everything, for example. It's taking our wisdom. Like if I go under looking at this difficult situation for somebody, it's not going to help anybody. It's taking wisdom and bringing it to life. It means balance. It might mean balance between compassion for ourselves and for someone else. It might mean balance between doing everything we can and realizing I'm not in charge. Things will unfold. It might mean the wisdom of not everything happens right away. Sometimes we plant a seed and we don't see the results right away. That doesn't mean it was wrong to go forward and plant that seed. When we bring wisdom to life, it manifests as a kind of balance. It's perspective. It doesn't sap the energy of compassion or our efforts to try. It actually replenishes them and helps us both have a longer term perspective and not to be so beholden to the ups and downs that accompany any undertaking. We don't just engage in constant frustration and impatience and demand. We have some balance as we go forward. So the far enemy of equanimity is reactivity. It's holding on or pushing away. The near enemy is indifference, actually. It's looks close on the surface, but that kind of coldness or cutting off, withdrawing which is indifference, is not the same as equanimity. With equanimity, we're fully engaged, but with wisdom. And the proximate cause is wisdom, and it's especially wisdom about just the changing nature in life. It's what the Buddha called the 8 vicissitudes of pleasure and pain, gain and loss, praise and blame, fame and disrepute. It's pleasure and pain, gain and loss, praise and blame, fame and disrepute. And he said, this is everyone's life. Different degrees, probably different amounts, but everyone experiences pleasure and pain. Gain and loss, praise and blame, fame and disrepute. As I've intimated, my favorite is usually to talk about praise and blame, because It can be like the very same thing you do, and some people praise you and some people blame you. And again, we learn to listen to feedback and to take it in, but if our whole sense of who we are and our integrity is based on never having any criticism, it's like, how can we really take stand on our own integrity? Because it will always be shifting and changing. So we need some balance. We need some perspective on things. The more we understand that everyone's life is pleasure and pain, gain and loss, praise and blame, fame and disrepute, the more we can deal with and learn from the difficult times, but with some balance. I was once hiking with some friends in this state park in California, and it was 3 days. We were going to walk in one direction and then turn around on the fourth day and come back along the same path to walk on the same path in the other direction. So this was day 3, and we were walking into the park, and it happened to be a day of very steady, unremitting downhill walking. And a friend and I, it's like we were almost struck by this simultaneous realization, and we stopped and looked at one another. And then he said, in a dualistic universe, downhill can only mean one thing. And sure enough, the next day when we turned around, walking along the same path, it was a day of many, many hours of uphill walking. So it's not that it's a dualistic universe on every level, but on the level in which we know pleasure and pain and gain and loss, it is. They're not the same. And some things just hurt. They're challenging, they're difficult, they hurt. It's not because we have a bad attitude or we need to, change how we think, and they hurt. We don't have to add to it with extra suffering, but that's a different thing. And to understand this is a part of life can give us a sense of balance as we move forward. Okay, so again, let's see if there are any questions or comments.
The first is that it's so helpful to have the near enemy, far enemy, and proximate cause illuminated, and building on that structure. When one meets the far enemy, what does one do?
In terms of kind of the meditation, it's a process of kind of the holding environment, with that far enemy. First of all, I would suggest what I've suggested earlier, like notice how you name it. Are you calling it bad? Are you calling it terrible? Are you falling into, I've been meditating this long. Why is it here? I spent all that money in therapy. Why is it here? Or can you just recognize that this is what's happening right now? And then look at it. Most of the time, as I also said earlier, when we have a strong feeling like strong jealousy come up, we get lost in consideration of the incident, the story, they got this and I didn't. And we so rarely pivot our attention and our interest to the feeling itself. Like, what does it feel like to have so much jealousy? So instead of thinking, I should get rid of this, why is it still here? It's like, what is this really? What does it feel like in my body? And then as you're watching it, notice you can deconstruct it. Like, what are the other feelings that are part of this bundle? Because all these feelings, like which are part of the near enemy or the far enemy, tend to be very complex. They're not singular, they're compounds. So you're looking at that jealousy, or you're looking at that anger. Let's say anger. And you may see moments of fear. You'll see moments of sadness. You'll see moments perhaps of guilt. You'll see moments of grief. You'll probably see moments of helplessness, because that's often considered at the root of a lot of kind of overwhelming anger. You're looking at jealousy, what do you see? So again, you have to not be so entranced with why am I jealous and what did they do and what did they say, but what does it feel like? And, you may see moments of grief. You may see self castigation. You'll see self blame. Why did I make that choice? I shouldn't have done that if I hadn't done that. And so that's a level of investigation that's really helpful. And then what we see is that these states are actually, because they're compounds, then the different elements are arising and passing away, arising and passing away. They're impermanent. They arise, they feel so solid and unremitting and who we really are. But if you actually take a look, they're fluid, they're moving, they're changing. They're as much a part of the impermanent universe as anything. And so there's a very different level of understanding that comes. We also use those exercises as a way of, especially sometimes, the awareness of the body. Like, what does it feel like in my body? As a way of bringing that kind of mindfulness into daily life. Like, I have a friend, as an example, who describes herself as the kind of person who could never say no. So she'd be at work, for example, and people would ask her to do things and she'd say yes. And it wasn't really her job. And she was kind of overwhelmed, but she was doing all this stuff. And so one day in her meditation, she purposely brought up those kind of scenarios in her mind so she could feel what was happening in her body as she's, meekly said yes. Or she prepared to say yes. And she saw this kind of panic arising, like this very visceral sense in her stomach, like that actually arrived before the thought, the cognition, maybe they won't like me if I say no, right? So that rush in her body came first. And that became her feedback system. When she was actually at work and she was asked that kind of question and she would feel that very panic come up in her body, that was her signal to say, I'll have to get back to you on that. It's like she couldn't bring herself to say no in the moment, but it gave her some space. So the investigation leading to understanding can serve us in many ways, and that will really help us have some skills when it comes to dealing with the far enemies, or really anything.
Thank you for that very practical and helpful description of the process. Is it transferable to the near enemy, or is there any distinction for how one works with the near enemy from the way one works with the far enemy?
I think it is transferable, and it's very similar. The near enemies are more subtle, they're more confusing because it feels right. Often, like, yeah, I should, uh, hold on, or I should be overwhelmed by this suffering. It's so terrible. And so sometimes I think we also need to bring in uh, real reflection, like, is this going to serve? What's the consequence of falling into this? As well as, what does this actually feel like? And, what's happening in the moment and recognizing it. And again, that, it's so much the case that mindfulness is not getting consumed by what's happening, but it's also not pushing it away. And it's a learned sense of balance right there, where we're not denying what's going on or disconnecting from it, but we're also not having it overwhelm us or define us. But I would use that additional reflection often in working with a near enemy, and just seeing, like, well, the last 5 times I erupted in anger, how much information did I lose? Just something like that, without blame. Like, another image I often use about anger, and again, I'm not talking about feeling anger, I'm talking about being overwhelmed by it. So it's kind of a more devastating thing. And one of the consequences is that the world shrinks, right? If you think about right now, think about the last time you were really angry at yourself. Like, just bring it up. Really angry at yourself. It's not a time where you're thinking, I said that stupid thing, but I did 5 great things same morning. It's like those 5 great things, they're gone. We have now collapsed our image of who we are around that stupid thing we said, and we believe we're only that and going to be that forevermore. So I sometimes talk about this time long ago when I was first on email. And in those days, if you got that sound, that said you have mail, it was like so exciting. Now it's like, oh my God, I can't believe how much email I get. But then it was like thrilling. So I was actually upstairs in this house and I was working on my desktop computer when I heard that magic sound. So I got off the thing I was working on and went to email, and there was somebody. And one of the questions he was asking me is, what's the problem with anger anyway? What do you think the problem is with being overcome by anger? So I wrote to him and I said, well, one of the issues with being overcome by anger is that you then tend to put people in a box. And I got offline. I went back to my project and something went terribly wrong between my computer and my printer, and I got really angry. So I was down on my hands and knees, like pulling out plugs and putting in other plugs. And the first person I was really angry at this was even before we had the phrase IT, our computer assistant, who was on vacation in Hawaii. And I was so angry at him that I forgot in that moment that the reason he was on vacation was because I had decided he needed a vacation. And the reason he was in Hawaii is because I had gone to the airport, which I had to do in those days, to transfer my frequent flyer miles to him so he could go to Hawaii. But it was like gone. That information was gone. I was so angry. And I was really angry at myself. Like, why are you so inept? Why can't you fix anything? Why don't you understand these things? In the meantime, I fixed it, but I hardly took a moment to appreciate the fact that I fixed it. So then I got back up in my chair and I was working on my project and I heard that magic sound again. So I went back to email and there was my original correspondence saying, I don't understand what you mean when you say, when we're really lost in anger, we just put people in a box. So I said, well, this is what just happened. I put this guy in a box. He's never here when I need him. Why isn't he here? He's abandoned me. And I put myself in a box. You're such a loser. You can't fix anything. Right? So I don't go through that whole story again, but I remind myself, look how much information is lost because I've now shut down. Just something like that. It's wisdom from life, from your own life, that you can bring to bear on these situations.
Thank you. Our next question is, care providers suffer with compassion fatigue. How can you prevent compassion fatigue and also treat it when it happens? And could you differentiate between empathy fatigue and compassion fatigue?
Okay, I went into this bit last night. There are researchers and practitioners who actually prefer the term empathy fatigue to compassion fatigue. The common term is compassion fatigue. And I'm told, like if you Google a word, Google will offer different suggestions about what they think you are searching for because so many people have searched for that in the past. So if you type in compassion, you'll get compassion fatigue because so many people research it and are suffering from it. But the distinction between empathy and compassion is also being made in many circles, including research circles. So go back to the definition I used: the trembling or the quivering of the heart, a movement of the heart toward to see if we can be of help. So the first part of that definition is really like the empathy part. It's the quivering of the heart. It's the movement of the heart as we see pain or suffering in someone. The second part is the compassion part, the movement toward to see if we can be of help. So really that common definition of compassion is kind of a compound we need some empathy in this world, and not just cognitive empathy of kind of, yeah, I kind of get where you're at, but that felt sense, that resonance. But it's not enough. It's like essential, but not enough because, as I said, we might feel genuine empathy, but are so exhausted to begin with, we can't muster the energy to move toward to see if we can be of help. We're just burnt out. Or we're frightened by the level of suffering that we see. So we just want to run away. There are lots of possible responses to empathy that are not compassion. So caregivers, I've often been struck by the irony in that there's some emphasis these days on empathy training, which seems really essential in a world that can be so cruel. But caregivers tend to have plenty of empathy. They actually don't need empathy training. It's almost more like we would say equanimity training, some balance. It's the balance between compassion for oneself and compassion for others. The balance between compassion and a realistic sense of limits, wisdom. We're not in control. I mean, no one has of yet, as far as I know, invented the chip. For example, we can put in someone else's brain while we have the remote control and we can say, cheer up. Would that we could. And if it's been invented, we don't have access to it, like life is not like that. Which again doesn't promote apathy or indifference or not trying, but we have some perspective about things. I've worked with many a caregiver. And first of all, I find that kind of didactic understanding of stress and its components and burnout and vicarious trauma is very helpful, because then you don't feel like this feeling I have is a sign of weakness. This disassociation or despair that I feel is not because I don't care, it's because I do care. But I need balance. And I found that that's extremely helpful to have an understanding, even a theoretical understanding of just what's going on. What is this dynamic? And helping rid one of some of that self-blame. There are also certain skills that one can use. Breathing. When we're really lost in fight or flight, we forget to breathe. And we can introduce just an awareness like that, almost in a kind of ritualistic way or a habit forming way. Like you make the resolve. Like I did this in the beginning of the pandemic, for example, where I was trying to introduce more compassion into my lived reality. I made the resolve not to just write an email and press send, but to write an email, take a few breaths, read it again, and then decide if I wanted to rewrite it or not. You just begin to introduce remembering to breathe. Maybe the most famous example of that is from Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnamese Zen teacher, who said, don't pick up your phone on the first ring. Let it ring 3 times and breathe. So the ringtone of the phone becomes the signal. Just take a few breaths. Then you reach for it. It's like that pause we can institute. So I once taught that. I was in a financial firm in New York City, and I looked up and I saw the complete panic on everyone's faces. And I said, okay, for you, just let it ring twice. That's enough. You don't have to let it ring 3 times. And it doesn't have to be that, but just some insertion of these exercises throughout your day, like just take a breath or just take a moment and drink that cup of coffee without also checking your email and also doing this and also doing that. just unitask every once in a while instead of multitasking will help us land back in our body, back in the moment, and then we can go on. There are also different exercises that are really helpful. I might have mentioned this last night too. If you are feeling a lot of anxiety, if it's just feeling like overwhelming, and most of those, there are many different kinds of breathing, but the simplest way I know to describe it is that if your out breath is longer than your in breath, they say the parasympathetic nervous system will take over from your sympathetic nervous system and you'll kind of chill. And your nervous system will have some repair. And you really can do that. They're very simple things like that, but it's in a way knowing it's okay to do them, that you don't have to just keep going and going and going and going and going with no respite and no effort to restore. It's just not going to work. And like, I remember when, some years ago, I was talking to a friend who's a writer, and I was saying, that image of like, if you're on a flight and the flight attendant makes the safety announcement and says, if the cabin pressure changes and the oxygen mask drops, put your own on first before you try to help anybody else. I said, I don't even think I can use that anymore. Like, so many people use it. It's become a cliche. Every person I know who gives talks use it. Every person I know who writes it. I don't think I can use it anymore. And my friend said, oh, I was just on an airplane and they made that announcement. And the woman sitting next to me turned to me and said, I could never do that. I could never put my own oxygen mask on first. And I thought, oh, maybe I can still use it. It's still like provocative and meaningful. Like, wow. But that's kind of the point. We feel so guilty, especially in a caregiving kind of role. But to actually remind oneself, you don't have to give up everything, but just spend a little time taking a few breaths or taking care of yourself or remembering what replenishes you. It's really important.
Thank you. We have a question from an individual who was present in the loving kindness practice. And as those who may have been there know, there's a portion of the practice where an individual who is difficult for you to think about or to relate to is invited into one's awareness. The individual's asking when that happens, and the intention is to offer the loving kindness affirmations, but the mind goes off to the races in a long narrative about that difficult person and why they're difficult. What is the right response as the person doing the meditation?
Okay, so the basic bookends, if you want to do a loving kindness meditation, classically is to begin with yourself as the recipient and to end with all beings everywhere, all of life. So those are like the bookends. And what you do in the middle can be different every day. Maybe you have a friend getting an award today, so you want to be sure to offer them loving kindness. Maybe you have a friend having surgery today, so you want to be sure to offer them loving kindness. Over time, not all in one session because it's too cramped. Over time, the different categories classically that we call to mind are oneself, a benefactor, someone who's helped us, somebody who the texts say when we think of them, we smile, a friend or maybe a series of friends, a neutral person, someone we neither like or dislike. And this is actually my secret favorite because I think it shows the mechanics of how the practice works. It's like, we don't know anything about this person. Maybe we see them now and then when we go to the grocery store because they work there or something like that. But over time, because we're actually calling them to mind and wishing them well, we actually feel different when we see them. There's just a sense of connection that there wasn't before. And then after a neutral person, a difficult person, somebody who we find difficult. In like when I practiced in Burma, the translation they used was enemy, so that was a little dramatic, but it can be that way sometimes. At least a difficult person. So it's oneself, benefactor, friend, neutral person, difficult person, and then all beings everywhere. So you may not do that. As I said, you can't do them all realistically in one session, but over time, this is like the experiment that we make. So in offering loving kindness to a difficult person, first of all, we may need to keep reminding ourselves of what loving kindness is and what it is not. It's not saying I want to have dinner with you like every night or ever. It's not saying I want to see you again. It's not saying what you did or do doesn't matter. It doesn't mean I'm going to give up fighting you, your agenda, and what you're trying to impose on other people. It does mean that as I reflect on the amount of time I spend obsessing about you and your terrible actions is robbing me of my life, or I'm afraid of you, in fact, and I need to do something to help mitigate the fear. So that might be cause for reflection. You might need to change the phrases. And that would be fine. As I said, you don't want to change them all the time because then you're just sitting and thinking, what should I say? But there are times when, like I have a student who wanted to offer loving kindness to his previously quite abusive mother. So there are a couple of elements that he wanted to. It wasn't coerced or forced. It was something he wanted to do. So this all happened when he was a child. He was now an adult. And he said the only phrase he could use was, may you be free of hatred. And that was fine. Like we measure progress in the practice not from a great burst of warm feeling, but from actually being able to do it. So you might need to change the phrase, and that would be fine. And it's also a time where we tend to be creative. We spend a little time kind of setting the scene. So, for example, in the Buddhist texts, they say, think of this person as an infant, so vulnerable to the actions of others, just as we all are. Think of them dying, not with glee, but look at that. After all this, all these grudges and all this hurt, we all have to let go of everything and then see what happens. And we extrapolate from that. People say to me things like, I imagine my difficult person on an island. It was food. I'm not trying to starve them, but no bridge, no boat, no aqueduct. They could not get near me. And then I found I could offer them some loving kindness. Or when I wrote that first book, Loving Kindness, I had taught a retreat where somebody said, my difficult person is the kind of person who never stops talking, and they just drive me crazy. So I imagine them bound and gagged in a chair, and then I could do loving kindness. And I kind of like that, like they're not really hurting the person, but they're setting the scene in a way they felt safe enough to do it. And so I put it in the book. And then when I got the manuscript back from the editor, it was like, that's the most horrible fantasy, and you're outrageous, and you've got to change that, and you've got to, so I didn't take it out, but I put in like reams of paragraphs explaining it, and reams of paragraphs explaining it at the end, because it's not an invitation to that, but it's an invitation to our creativity. Or sometimes we say, do loving kindness for both of you at once. Because the problem is that perhaps the problem is that we tend to defer too much and give up a sense of our own need to be happy. So it would be, may we be safe, may we be happy, or whatever phrases you're using. So it's also an invitation to be creative in those ways.
Thank you. As you've spoken about the process, you've highlighted the quality of sensing emotions in the body, could you speak to the process of actually then touching oneself, perhaps with a hand to the heart or any other physical contact you give to your own body?
There are teachers, most notably, say, Kristen Neff, who really has explored self-compassion, coined the term, in Western psychology, and has done a tremendous amount of work on that, who really suggests doing just that, placing your hand, it's not your anatomical heart, it's like the heart center, um, in your body. And she says research has shown that it really has some efficacy. And sometimes even without words, you just kind of do that. And there's some level of comfort. And so you can look up her work, most particularly about that. And there are other teachers who really recommend it. It's just not the way I was taught, and so I don't tend to really emphasize that.
Thank you. We have no remaining questions from our participants, and I'll let you guide us in our closing moments together.
Great. So I would just thank you, of course. And then why don't we just sit together silently for like 1 minute?
Thank you.
So thank you. Be well, be happy.
Thank you, Sharon. We're very grateful to you for your life's work.
Thank you.